Hello and welcome to the Inspirational Leader Series, which is a collection of short interviews with sharp, impactful leaders that I know and respect because the business world needs more refreshing people like them. And my name is Teresa Brazen. I am a leadership and executive coach. I work with design leaders and leadership teams, and I help them to maximize their impact and elevate the stature of design inside of their organizations. And today I have with me a very lovely guest who I'm excited to talk with by the name of Vincent Brathwaite. And he is a senior program manager for design operations at GitHub. He's also a very seasoned educator and a prolific speaker. And he was previously the director of the Design Leadership Forum at Invision. And his mission is to design experiences that help leaders positively impact the world, which is a mission I jive with. So thank you for joining me, Vincent.
Awesome. Thank you for having me on the show, Teresa. My pleasure to be here.
Yay. I'm so glad you're here. And you are a man of a breadth of experience. So you have been in the design world, you've been teaching, you mentor, you've been on boards, you ran the Design Leadership Forum. I mean, a ton of different experiences. And I am really interested in how those experiences have shaped you as a leader. And I think most importantly, like what's been a difficult but an instrumental challenge in that journey that has shaped the kind of leader that you are?
Well, thank you for this question. I absolutely love this question because it speaks to a topic that has been on my mind for quite some time, actually, and that is identity. You know, for me, being a Black designer who started out very early in this industry has been instrumental to where I am, but also very much a challenge. And I'll start with why that has been a challenge. I'll share this stat. So according to recent studies by the National Society of Black Engineers, Black designers make up only 3% of the workforce, right? And so with these numbers being staggering, what this means that for my entire design career, I've always been a minority. I remember sort of the initial shock and discomfort that I felt walking into rooms with my design counterparts. And the challenge also for me is that I was either, again, one of very few designers or the only Black designer when entering into spaces with other designers. And these spaces were oftentimes board positions, client meetings, or even design events. And so I want to also emphasize the fact that the challenge wasn't so much about me existing in those spaces as it was for me navigating the biases of others while in those spaces. So I have a story. So for example, I remember attending a fairly exclusive design conference in San Francisco, and exclusive in the sense that there were a limited number of people at the design event. And the speakers were from Airbnb and Dropbox, IBM, all the big names, and they were sharing information that hadn't been made public just yet. And so, as I mentioned earlier, whenever I enter these types of spaces, I'm usually one of very few Black designers. And that's important because this event was no exception. I was one of about a handful of Black designers in the sea of hundreds of people. And for me, that was normal and that was okay. But what happened was during one of the breaks, all of the attendees, we went to the area with the food to replenish, to network, and to stretch our legs. And while in the line, one of the attendees walked up to me and asked if I could check in the back on when they were going to bring out more of a particular food item. And so I looked down at my attendee lanyard that was similar to theirs, and I looked back up at them and I politely said, "I don't work here." And as though they had been awakened from a deep sleep, their eyes grew wide and they immediately responded, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you did." And then they walked away. And so I was left with the reminder that I was, in fact, the minority in the group, and the biases that often come with that are still very much true, even in that space. Even while wearing an attendee's lanyard and holding a laptop bag in one hand and also a small plate of food in the other. So the only thing to suggest that I was an attendee at this event. And I share this story because it best summarizes the challenge that I've often experienced, and that is not being recognized as an equal in the design space.
Mm.
Being a minority in this space has also been advantageous because it means I stand out. And I've used that to my advantage when building relationships within the field. It's also been instrumental in my career because it has made me more empathetic to those who might have similar experiences of feeling left out, which lends itself to being more inclusive, me being more an inclusive designer and design leader, and advocating for the other voices that aren't being considered when I'm in the room. And this doesn't mean advocating for only Black people, but other people of color, disabled people, women, etc.
So thank you for sharing that story. And I think you're surfacing for us just this experience of, I think like just the navigating a career is tough.
Yeah.
Learning how to be a leader is tough, right?
Yeah.
And then there's this other layer of learning how to do all of that in a context where there aren't a lot of people like you. And there are biases that people may or may not be aware of. So there's like just multiple layers of navigation.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, the impact on you in terms of like bringing that back to your leadership is you're more attuned, like advocacy is something you think about and you're paying attention to how to advocate for all kinds of people and who needs to get advocated for.
Yep.
And you said empathy and inclusivity. And what's important about advocacy as a leader?
I think it's important because it's the responsibility that we have, right? As a leader, it's not about dictating and about telling others what to do. It's about setting an example and creating spaces. And so for me, advocacy is important because it utilizes the responsibility that we have as leaders to be able to bring in the voices that aren't in the room and to point out other people that need to be pointed out in terms of their contribution, their intellect, their uniqueness. And so for me, that's important because it says, hey, don't just look at me or listen to me. Also listen to John, listen to Sarah, listen to Dominique, who are also here, who also may not be here in this room, so that we can all sort of move the dial together as it relates to the goal that we, have established within the organization.
Well, and what it brings up for me is like maximizing the intelligence, the creativity, the different ways of solving problems, the different ways of looking at problems that are available to you inside your organization or your team.
Exactly.
And so the advocate, there's like the moral piece of it. And then there's also just, from a really pragmatic business perspective that like you're leaving smarts on the table,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, I would hope that in our hiring practices that we're trying to get the best, the brightest people into our spaces to help us achieve and accomplish the goals that we have set for the organization. And so when we are not advocating for the people that are in the rooms, or maybe not in the room, but in a part of the organization, that to your point, we're leaving smarts on the table. We're not really utilizing the money, the investment that we have spent or that we have made into these people to bring them into our organization. And so when we don't allow for them, or we don't create space as leaders for those people to show up, then what was the point? what was the point? What was the all of the energy and the efforts to find the people, to go through the interview process, to then hire them, to onboard them, only to have them sit in a corner and exist in a space all by themselves?
Mm-hmm. So then let's take this another step further. What would you advise? I'm thinking about sort of two parties in this equation, right? So what would you advise to emerging minority leaders about navigating this reality? And, obviously we want them to thrive as leaders. So any thoughts for them? And then if we have time for it, also, like, what would you advise to leaders of teams who want to be thoughtful about this, and make sure that they're not, that they're really leveraging the people that are on their team?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, for the emerging minority leaders, I would advise them not to lose themselves and their identity in the process of developing their leadership and navigating these spaces. It's really tempting to assimilate to how the majority may behave or think. But what I believe makes the industry really effective is us bringing our unique experiences that we get to the conversations and to our work. For me, early in my career, I thought I had to make myself small as possible, not to take up too much space in a room, because I didn't want others to feel uncomfortable by my presence as a Black man. And then I realized that being that way by default was actually stifling my creativity and my contribution to teams that I was a part of, and even my own growth. So I decided to embrace the fact that I grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood that was under-resourced, that was sometimes violent, but also extremely collaborative. I didn't shy away from the fact that I had long dreads at the time that weren't necessarily considered cool or professional. Now, not so much. I mean, it is. But at that time, it wasn't. And even, especially within one of the most creative spaces in the workforce. And I accepted and embraced and nurtured my individualism while still allowing others to be themselves, so that together we can accomplish our shared goals. And I would encourage, again, other young minority designers who are becoming design leaders to do the same. Love yourself so much that it makes it difficult for others not to respect you.
Love yourself so much that it makes it difficult for other people to not respect you and not to love you.
Yes, and not to love you back. Yeah. And then as it relates to senior leaders, I would encourage them, to continue to advocate, but also to create or to help create and make spaces more inclusive for other people to be themselves and to show up as their authentic self, however that may be, and guide them along the journey as well, for them to be able to contribute to the conversations and to the work that is being done.
And like, can you, I always think about it's easy to say, make a space, but like how, are there like specific thoughts you have around that?
Absolutely. So when it comes to specifically this idea of making space for more inclusivity, the challenge oftentimes is found within senior leadership, within the person that they see when looking in the mirror. And I know that might be difficult to hear, but it's also what is true and what is sometimes needed. Because what I've learned over the years in working with other leaders in this space of inclusive design leadership specifically is that it's not as difficult as many make it out to be in terms of, the methodologies or the practices that we have to do to create this space or to make space for others. That sometimes the difficulty is the personal changes in order for one more to have those spaces. And practically speaking, that may mean assessing your own biases and contribution to the space that's not being inclusive, or how you're showing up as a leader. Some questions that a leader could ask themselves to start to unravel sort of their potential personal barrier that they're creating is, why haven't you been looking into other resources when recruiting, right? Are you looking at historically Black colleges? Are you looking at, local universities or institutions? Why haven't you pointed out in rooms that in other senior managers that there's an area of, there's a gap, right? As it relates to who's in the room or who we are, targeting as it relates to research participants, et cetera, right? Making that known into those spaces with other managers and your manager is something that you want to ask yourself if you're doing. And then another really important question to ask yourself as a senior leader is, what are you afraid of losing by stepping into this space of discomfort? By asking the difficult questions, by pointing out things that may seem obvious, but people aren't talking about. there's a fear that's there that's preventing you to ask that question. And what are you afraid of losing? And where does that fear come from? And then
Mm,
also, the question to ask yourself is, how do you think you will be perceived if you started to challenge the way things are being done at your organization, right? Do you think that you're going to be, ostracized? Do you think that you're going to, be seen as someone who is, too challenging, and to the point where you then, lose your job? Like, what is it that you think that you are going to, or how do you think you're going to be perceived by the eyes of your peers? And why is that? Why is that true for you? And why is that a barrier for you to step up and to create this space? So I would say start there before we get into any actual processes or frameworks. Start with these questions and be brutally honest with yourself, because once you are able to answer those questions, that it will, in answering those questions, it will start to point to the minor changes that a leader can make to help their work environment be more inclusive and to start creating those spaces that we were just talking about.
It's really interesting because I've had this conversation with a version of this conversation with a few other people, and that they said the same thing, which is it's not actually that hard.
Yeah.
Sorry, the printer's going in my office. um, and I think you're bringing, for me, like a new layer of understanding about that, which is the biggest hurdle perhaps is actually all here.
Yeah.
It's not actually the tactics. Like, so you gave the example, a tactic with recruiting, it's not that hard to explore different ways of recruiting for people who aren't just going to be the people in your own community. It may be unfamiliar, but it's actually not that hard to find ways to do that. You probably do some Google searching and find some recruiting companies that are focused on that, for example. But and so when you bring it back to your own self as a leader, I don't know, it brought to mind for me, one of the things that I work with people on in coaching is perception. How we perceive things affects we have choices about our perspectives, basically, and we can get really caught up in them. And I think you're asking people to do the work of actually sort of sitting with themselves and asking themselves some tough and interesting questions around their relationship to diversity and inclusion, and what their behavior has been, and fears they might have around showing up differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't have to just be about, diversity and inclusion, but just as a leader and the responsibility, going back to that word advocacy, and sometimes to be an advocate for, your the members of your team, that you have to ask difficult questions of your peers, other senior leaders. And sometimes to do that, it is going to require you to do a self-assessment and to see what is preventing you from creating that space where the members of your team feel comfortable enough to show up as their authentic self, right? Because the members of the team are going to take their cues from you as a leader, right? And if they see that you're not necessarily, creating the space or helping to create that space, then they're not going to step in front of you as the leader and say, well, I'll do it, right? That's not typically what's going to happen. And so, when you find as a leader, you are, there is a either resistance or there is a lack of the space that we keep talking about being created for other people to show up, then one has to really do that sort of honest and sometimes difficult work of really assessing their perspective, how they see themselves, and how they see their environment, and what is contributing to to that, because they are a leader because of their experience, because of their knowledge, and because of their sort of like unique ability. So there is an inherent respect that comes with being a leader. And so I think sometimes it's up to that leader to really tap into that and utilize their presence and the inherent respect that others have for them as leaders to really start to shape and shift what is happening within these spaces.
Yeah, so there's themes in there of safety, like creating environments that feel safe so that people can show up as their authentic selves. I think you have a hypothesis, and I would agree with it, but people have different hypotheses, that businesses benefit when people can show up as who they are.
Absolutely.
Generally, I mean, don't take your bad day out on everybody, but outside of
right. We're not talking about you just,
better
like cussing everybody out. No.
Yeah.
Don't do
Yeah, but
that.
in the design world where people are creating together, removing personal barriers helps people with being able to do good work together too. And I think the other big thing that you're bringing up is just remembering that you are a model and that people are looking to you for cues as to what is and isn't okay. And so even if it is uncomfortable to sort of do that self-investigation or to make your own behavioral changes or have uncomfortable conversations, it's worth it because people are looking to you for those signals.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Oh, Vincent, I wish we had more time to talk, but we don't. So I have to wrap. Thank you so much for sharing your experience in your leadership journey and your thoughts and ideas for others. And I just really appreciate you making time.
Oh, well, thank you so much again, Teresa. This has been a pleasure for me whenever I get to share in opportunities like this, especially inspiring others. It's something that I don't take for granted and that I enjoy thoroughly. So thank you for the opportunity and thank you for these great questions. I hope it was helpful to you and your audience.
Yeah, thank you. And for the rest of you, if you are interested in hearing more interviews with other inspiring people like Vincent, there are more of those on my blog, and you can find that at teresabrazen.com. Thank you for joining us.